It was a moment for me where I thought maybe my wishful thinking about history is the right way to think about history, because maybe we are moving the right path with regards to these words. So we are now in 2026, and I'll just mention a few things that are unfolding with regards to race in the United States. Oh, I have to hold this.
That's right, because you have to talk in the mic, yeah.
I do have to. Okay.
Yep, so my.
Just, it's from the top of my head. I could probably, if I spent a little more time preparing notes, the list could have been much longer. We basically have an administration that is led by white nationalists with strong rhetoric of white nationalism. We have an administration that favors immigration of white Afrikaners to the United States and discourages or suppresses immigration of others. We have an administration that just now in Minneapolis is racial profiling its own Black police officers, which is just mind-boggling to think about that. And we have an administration that words that we thought were just common practice, such as racial justice, DEI, have become now potentially a liability on campuses and elsewhere, where we as professors need to be mindful of language that we use, lest we are reported to the university's administration of certain words that we use that are improper. It's not only race, but there are other. I think it is great that the university retains this tradition of Walk the Walk Week, and it's really important that we honor Martin Luther King's Day. But we are in a serious setback. And I know that you will address all of that, and you are experiencing this firsthand. So I really look forward to your explorations, and as the title of this panel suggests, I think you will also speak about hope. I hope you will speak about hope.
That's your hope. It's all you get, Dr. Coffin.
All right, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Gwendolyn Purifoye, who will take it from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out in the, I don't know, near a blizzard or blowing of snow. I know a couple of years ago, we had a blizzard as well for the event, so we have more people online than in person, and it's fine. So we appreciate you weathering the weather to come out here. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we will begin with the questions. And then, of course, we're going to leave plenty of space to take questions from the audience that is present here, but as well as those who are online. I'm going to start and go in the order I have here. So first, I want to introduce you to Dr. Greg Wilson, who is an assistant professor of management and public affairs and by courtesy sociology at The Ohio State University, because I have to make sure I do that right. At Ohio State, he is a faculty affiliate at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and the Center for Ethics and Human Values. He also holds an affiliation with the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is also a faculty fellow in the Justice Labs of America at Brown University. Dr. Wilson's research agenda critically examines how the nonprofit sector is racialized and its implications for organizations led by people of color, with particular focus on Black-led organizations. His work interrogates how racialized structures and norms shape organizational experiences, strategies, and capacities for change within this sector. His scholarship has appeared in leading interdisciplinary and field-specific journals. Currently, Dr. Wilson is advancing 3 interrelated projects, theorizing racialization in the nonprofit sector that helps understand the processes and mechanisms through which racialization operates, exploring how organizations led by people of color, especially Black-led organizations, identify, interpret, and respond to racialization, and examining how organizations engage in racialized change work, in racialized change work aimed at challenging and disrupting racialization within the sector. Next, we have Dr. Amber Hewitt. Dr. Amber Hewitt is the inaugural Chief Equity Officer for the District of Columbia government, where she leads the development and implementation of the city's first racial equity strategic plan, guiding more than 35 agencies and engaging hundreds of residents in shaping equity-centered policy. In this role, she established the Office of Racial Equity's foundational governance structures, developed racial equity budgets, analysis tools now used across agencies. And she also launched the ORE agency cohort program, a cross-government capacity building initiative that has strengthened alignment and operational equity practice. She previously served as the Director of Health Equity at Families USA, where she chaired a national task force of 23 organizations to advance Medicaid and maternal health equity, and as a manager of policy and advocacy at Nemours Children's Health. A counseling psychologist by training, Dr. Hewitt earned her PhD in counseling psychology from Loyola University Chicago, where she also served as a commencement speaker. She has advised members of Congress, I think they need your advice now too, and published across outlets focused on health equity, public policy, and applied psychology. Next to her is Dr. Joseph M. Butler. He is a dedicated leader and advocate for equity in higher education, deeply committed to fostering inclusivity and access within academic community. As the Assistant Dean for Access, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Humanities and Social Sciences at Princeton University, Dr. Butler brings extensive experience from UChicago grad, where he spearheaded transformative recruitment and retention strategies aimed at supporting graduate students from diverse backgrounds. His innovative approach integrates mentorship, strategic partnerships, and community engagement to enrich the educational journey and success of historically underrepresented groups. At Princeton, Dr. Butler is poised to advance these initiatives through pioneering programs such as the Horizon Fellowship Initiative and collaborations with minority-serving institutions, ensuring that all students have the resources and support to thrive. With a passionate commitment to creating pathways for success, Dr. Butler continues to inspire change and drive progress towards a more equitable academic landscape. He also received his PhD from Loyola University Chicago in sociology. And then we have Dr. Crystal Jackson, and she is the president and founder of Good Human, an independent consulting firm based in Chicago, Illinois. She is a social scientist with a PhD in sociology, also from Loyola University Chicago. You see, I'm just promoting the Ramblers here. With over 2 decades of experience in the design and implementation of community-centered strategies aimed at improving educational, health, and economic outcomes among marginalized populations. Dr. Jackson's work emphasizes research to practice methodologies that advance community engagement, civic participation, and data-informed strategic planning within nonprofit and community-based organizations. Her scholarship and professional practice focus on comprehensive community development, including the strengthening of deeply rooted local institutions and the cultivation of networks that mobilize financial, social, and relational capital to support sustained and equitable social change. Please join me in welcoming our panel of esteemed scholars and practitioners. All right. So the first question for this evening is that racial violence itself is spatialized, which means that it takes places where we can see it in particular spaces, whether it's cities, rural areas, inside of stores. So examples of spatialized racial violence would include racial residential segregation, Confederate statues, and signs. So the first question I have for our panelists, how do you see acknowledging and considering the spatiality of racial violence as important to any discourse on reducing racism and attenuating its impact? And you can go in any order. Just make sure you speak into the mic.
Am I it? Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. P, my trusted friend and colleague. I also want to thank Dr. Professor Kaufman for this generous invite to this conversation. I can't help but be reminded as we start this conversation, especially as we're coming off the heels of this past year's MLK celebration. And I was reminded of this, Professor Kaufman, when I heard you talk about the ways in which history is not linear sometimes, that instead of moving progressively forward, oftentimes we find ourselves in positions where we are addressing policies that indeed are quite regressive. So that quote that came to my mind was, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. And within the context of this conversation, I point to certain periods of time over the course of even recent history where we see policies and practices from urban renewal to the plan for transformation of public housing, to earlier iterations of redlining, the development of structures that served to separate neighborhoods that were once contiguous from each other. Speaking from an experience as a Chicagoan, go Bears, the building of one of the primary expressways in Chicago, the Dan Ryan, served to separate neighborhoods that were once contiguous, where one side of those neighborhoods received an abundance of resources, the other side of those neighborhoods did not. So to Dr. Kaufman's point, we are constantly faced with instances of regression that seem to set us back when it comes to addressing racial disparities. And the consequences of those are great. So what we see from that is, even looking in the most recent examples of racialized violence in space, what we see in Minnesota, what we saw in Chicago, what we're now seeing in Maine, with all of the attention that ICE has given to those communities through violent interactions. The notion of spatiality is the thing that's constant there. And so we have to have a focus on how we address that spatiality. I'll offer one thing and I'll pass it to my co-panelist. As Dr. P mentioned, I have the opportunity to work with a lot of nonprofits and foundations in Chicago on this precise issue. How do we address racial segregation in Chicago? What do those initiatives look like? And so some of the ways in which that bears out, at least in my experience, is through initiatives that are focused on local grassroots efforts that serve to introduce resources that are community driven, community identified, community led. And so that the changes that we see are those that are owned by the community. I think that to the point on hope, there is hope, right? As long as those initiatives are there and in place. Do they take time? Is the progress linear? So the answer to both of those questions, yes, they take time. No, the process is not linear, but there's the prospect of hope that comes out of those things once we put enough resources and determination around them.
Thank you. I think I want to do the same acknowledgments again, just thanking folks for the opportunity to be in the space. But I think like racial violence has to be considered not as episodic, right? But more so as ecological. And when we start to understand racial violence as ecological, I think it helps us to understand space as pedagogy, right? Space starts to teach us how to exist, and it frames who we are. So when you walk into a room, I was joking before we came into this space about a colleague who was unfamiliar with the concept of race and space and like how race and space engages. And the reality of that situation is that for some people, you don't have to recognize the violence that exists for others in specific spaces if the space is designed for you, right? And so when we walk into rooms and we talk about monuments and statues and signage and the plethora of things that exist in physical spaces, they communicate things to us, right? Even when we look at the structure and the design of this room, right? All of the chairs are structured looking at the stage, which makes the stage the focal point. And when we think about the fact that specific spaces, even when we're talking about even what cities are being targeted by some of the violence that's occurring right now in what we're calling immigration enforcement, it's legalized violence, right? And these things are not new. They are consistently transforming because institutions are consistently transforming. And so we have to understand the relationship, again, between space, place, and intention. And so when we start to think about it from that context, it helps us to understand how things like reoccurring trauma continues to happen, right? And I think as we explore and think about the fact that all of these incidences are consistently caught on film, what does it mean to be re-traumatized by these things over and over again? And where's the off-ramp, right? How much of it do you pay attention to, and how much of it do you try to ignore for your own well-being? That is also a form of trauma that we're not talking about. And I think I say all of these things to really get us to understand that it is absolutely essential that we think about, we center, we have conversations around the implications of space when it comes to racial violence. Because if we don't, then we miss the experience of countless people around us and the trauma that they're undergoing. And then we miss the opportunity to be of support. And so I'll stop there and pass it to my colleagues.
All right, can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon. Also want to say thank you for being here and inviting me. This is my fourth time being invited to this panel. I think 2 years ago I was couldn't make it. I was zoomed in, so I was glad that we're all able to weather the storm to get here. As mentioned in my introduction, I serve as the Chief Equity Officer for DC government. I just want to note that my perspectives and opinion here are of my own and not representative of the mayor or DC government. And since we're also talking about race and space, I also just wanted to locate myself. So I grew up in the Deep South in Shreveport, Louisiana, where I saw visible signs of oppression. For example, I'm seeing Confederate flags being flown in front of people's homes, or even seeing Confederate flags displayed on my peers' T-shirts. And fast forward now, being in Washington, D.C., walking 2 blocks from my place to the metro to go downtown to City Hall to work, being under the surveillance of the National Guard. So from the Deep South and many other places in between to where I am now, that didn't remove the presence of racialized violence. It just showed up differently. And my colleagues hinted on the psychology of race and space. I want to build upon that. As Dr. P mentioned, I'm a counseling psychologist by training. But first, I just want to start with the definition of violence and then link that to psychological violence. So we all know at a basic level that violence is the intentional use of force or power, threatened or actual, to cause either harm, psychological harm, injury, or even death. And we're seeing that on the national scale. When we talk about psychological violence, we're talking about non-physical behavior such as racial insults, intimidations, or other threats that undermines a person's psychological well-being. So I think that's important to bring in the psychology of this when we're talking about race and space. And Dr. P, you mentioned Confederate statues as part of the question. So take a Confederate statue, for example. That in and of itself is not just an offense. It can be experienced as a psychological assault. And there's decades of research in the psychological literature that links the presence of racial threat cues in space to things such as higher cortisol levels, increased stress responses, and overall negative impact on a person's mental health. And in my previous research, I studied the gendered racial identity development of Black young people and adolescents. So if a young Black child is passing by a statue that depicts someone who worked to keep their ancestors in enslavement, that is an example of emotional violence that's repeated on a daily basis. And it isn't always what's visible. So for example, if a child is growing up in a neighborhood that's over-policed or underfunded, and if there isn't positive racial socialization going on in the home, instilling positive messages of your history and who you are as a young Black child, then that child could potentially internalize negative stereotypes about themselves as well. So as my colleagues mentioned, racism has always built into space. And in my current work, we talk to our colleagues around examples of that. So we actually bring in examples at the local context, things such as redlining, and actually showing in homes across neighborhoods in DC, pictures, examples of restrictive housing covenants that were embedded into property deeds that prevented Black people, also people of Jewish descent, from passing down land and buying land. So if we're talking about spaces that has embedded violence, either harming psychological or person physically, when we're talking about peace, how can we build peace on top of a violent landscape? So I wanted to mention that, and that's why it's just very, very necessary to bring all of these concepts into the conversation.
Thank you for that. You reminded me of a number of things that I'm going to talk about as well. But first of all, it's good to be back at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you so much, Dr. P, for organizing this wonderful panel. Thank you to Kroc for its support and for its moral clarity, especially when higher education is becoming a place where these perspectives are being silenced. And thank everybody who braved the whiteout blizzard conditions to get here today, and everybody online too. I want to express our collective gratitude for, all of what has been said. I think has done a wonderful job sort of situating this conversation. And I just want to add, a few points. One, I'm just a teacher from the Ohio State University, so I want to call your attention first to a wonderful reading that I actually referenced right before we came out from Elijah Anderson. It's called The White Space. So you do your, I'm being a good teacher and giving you a reading that you can look up, pull up that article and read for your intellectual consumption. But one of the things about that article, and I'm going to get to what I want to say in a moment, but one of the things about that article that I think is relevant for this conversation is that Anderson sort of describes this kind of white space. But what's crucial is that he says that despite the challenges for people of color navigating, particularly African Americans navigating this white space, they still have to navigate it as a condition of their existence. And so that means that you cannot be sort of immune or separated from this particular environment, because so much of about that environment has implications for your life chances. And so I wanted to make sure that I raised that because I think it's an important thing to consider. Now, I'm a sociologist by training, and much of the work that I do is informed by race scholarship, but I'm drawing upon kind of this historical perspective for some recent work that I think is really important for this conversation. So, like you, I've spent some time, not of my lifetime growing up, but some time in the Deep South in Montgomery, Alabama. And Montgomery, Alabama is a really, really interesting case study for thinking about the spatialization of race. In a paper that I hope is forthcoming in a journal, I talk extensively about kind of the built environment and how Montgomery, Alabama is kind of a case study on the extent to which it sort of is a monument to the kinds of racial trauma that we are discussing and will continue to discuss tonight. And so in this paper, I talk extensively about the existence of something like Court Square Fountain. You can look it up when you get a chance, which was kind of the site of slave markets in Montgomery, Alabama. Sorry, I have a 4:30 alarm that goes off, that has been going off for like 5 years, and I won't change it because I don't know what I set it for. But, but, so the point that I was making is that the slave markets were sort of facilitated at the Court Square Fountain. And right near the fountain, you have all of these kinds of signs that kind of remind you of kind of the racial injustices that kind of, that sort of surround the city, and all of these other physical, markers. And so quite literally, Montgomery, Alabama represents kind of this built environment through which to kind of think about the spatial, the ways in which race and space kind of intersect in these ways. And then the other point that I would note is that for the organizations that I study, Black-led organizations, those that are led by an African American and where the majority of the employees identify as Black, actually sort of draw strength from those built environments, because in Montgomery, it's kind of a contradictory environment. So on the one hand, you have something like Court Square Fountain as this kind of physical monument to the slave market and slave trade, but then right across the street, you have the bus stop where Rosa Parks refused to be removed from her seat on the bus. And so Montgomery, the Deep South, is a really important context, I think, where we can begin thinking about this. There are others, but I think that's just one.
Thank you all for your answers to that. And so in the spatialization of race, it means that it's spread abroad. I'm going to begin by this next question by reading a scripture from the Holy Bible. Galatians 5:14 and 15, which says, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another." And what we see in our world is that anti-Blackness in all of its forms is a global epidemic. What does this statement mean to you, and why consider it and the conditions it creates in our conversations about racial violence? And you can go in any order.
Brief response to this, and you mentioned Alabama. When I think about anti-Blackness as a global epidemic, a global phenomenon, it reminds me of a quote by Dr. King that we all may know: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere." And he wrote that while sitting in a jail in Alabama, in the city of Birmingham, and he was accused of sort of meddling into the business of Birmingham. So that shows you that injustice doesn't recognize borders, and neither does anti-Blackness. So I think it's really important to talk about anti-Blackness outside of the U.S. or just being a U.S. issue, and it being a global structure. So we're seeing what's happening across the U.S. Over policing, but we're also seeing Black people over policed in Brazil, France, Colombia, Canada, and across the African continent through neo-colonial systems. We aren't just seeing control based on physical occupancy, but through economic domination, military presence, and global policy that still benefits the West at the expense of Black people as well as other indigenous populations. And I think some of my colleagues sort of evoked sort of the humanity issue in all of this. And I think that was also evoked in that scripture. So it shows up not only in the way that Black people are treated as threats, that our lives are indisposable, that we're constantly having to prove our worth as human beings. And I just wanted to sit with that. Even as I read that and think about that, it just kind of stops me in my track. And I live in this reality and in this existence. So we're talking about anti-Blackness. It isn't just built into institutions, it also gets into our minds. So it determines sometimes the ways that Black people are treated, but also how Black people see themselves. So again, I'm just trying to weaving through sort of the psychology of race and space and how that impacts us from a holistic perspective. So I think it's important to name it, because we can't address what we don't name, and we can't fight what we refuse to see or even acknowledge.
I speak after Amber because I think maybe my comments are related to yours. When I think about the epidemic of anti-Blackness, it's not only evident in policy, the refusal of the United States as one of the most powerful nations in the history, if not the most powerful nation in the history of the world, to provide support to African nations experiencing, even now, today, in this moment, genocide and civil war, unless there is some return on their investment by way of rare earth minerals. It's also practices, everyday practices that we experience in the day-to-day. I was talking with my partner, who is a Black male, and we live in downtown Chicago. It's a lovely, lovely neighborhood, and each of us go out every day. We get our steps, and he said that he walked in the house one day and he said, "I can't believe what just happened." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Oh, this woman who happened to be white and older made gestures for him to stop kind of following her. She said, 'I'm going to call the police.' What she didn't know is that my partner is a deputy chief of community policing for Chicago Police Department. She could not see beyond his phenotype, to understand that she had in that moment probably the best friend that she could possibly ask for in that space." But I also want to call attention to what I believe we're seeing now in the United States as an act of anti-Blackness. I have been shocked and appalled at the absence of racial histories and experiences. If you all have noticed in the news, there have been several reports on the dismantling of monuments or exhibitions that discuss the enslavement of Africans. That absence of experiences and of race to others, particularly African Americans, reifies exclusive narratives that lead to I should say they reify exclusive narratives that folks like Martin Luther King, who we've invoked twice now, have worked for generations to eradicate. So I think that while we're talking about what anti-Blackness is, we also need to talk about what's absent from our spaces that would help us to eradicate anti-Blackness and or find dialogues to discuss it.
Hear or think about this concept and phrasing, right? It reminds me that Blackness is this foundational other, right? Blackness becomes a point of scrutiny and even distraction at different times, right? So for me, when we think about anti-Blackness in a global context, right, you have to talk about the history. So I pretend some days that I'm a theorist, right? And so when you think about theory, you try to understand all of the things that go into the foundation and the formulation of a thing. And so when I think about that, right, like it's impossible for us to think about anti-Blackness in a global context without considering, right, colonialism, without considering, right, like these different things that have caused us as a society to be able to relegate Blackness as disposable, right? We consistently see it as an opportunity to harvest the things that we like and to other and vilify the things that we don't. And that's something that exists here in the US, in a European context, right? Like it's a global conversation when we think about at the core, at the foundation, this concept of Blackness as other and problematic, right? Tying all the way back to the ideas and the concept of deviance, right? When we think about deviance, at the core of that is how we're defining and thinking about this problematic other. And I won't jump too deep onto that, but I really want us to understand that when I hear this phrasing, when I think about like anti-Blackness in a global context, I really, really consider it as othering. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole, right, start to research and understand what othering means, what it does, right? Like I think, Amber, you mentioned the psychological impact of being othered. And hopefully at some point in this conversation, we'll be able to have an experience together where we all get an opportunity to really recognize and feel the visceral nature of having to be other in a space. But again, I'll leave it at that and just say anti-Blackness for me in this context means the foundational other.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of echo everything that everybody else has said here. You know, especially what Dr. Butler was just talking about in terms of the other. So in the context that we are sort of thinking about this more globally, Blackness becomes kind of a reference category in a lot of ways, wherein all that we sort of think about in terms of sort of that is kind of problematic is kind of rooted in that kind of reference category. And it kind of reminded me of an experience that I had when I was in Denmark last year, when I was, riding the subway, the metro there, and these white officers were kind of patrolling the metro, and they were trying to figure out kind of who was paying because of the system that was going on there. And, I heard lots of people on the train talking about how they had not paid, to get on the train because apparently maybe that's kind of a common custom. But of course, I'm in another country. I paid for the metro. And, these officers immediately approached me amongst all of these other people as if I, had not paid. Now, I, of course, cannot say why they approached me, but I was also the only person that was presenting as kind of African American in that particular context. The other thing that I would say is that the word epidemic, I think, is an important way to kind of think about this, particularly because in this moment in the United States, I think that there is a concerted effort to rewrite history and a concerted effort to roll back the progress that we've made, not just historically, during the 60s, but also some of the gains that we have made even in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And, one of my mentors calls it a blacklash in a lot of ways. And so some might think that the word epidemic is kind of, hyperbolic thinking. But I think that the word epidemic captures the seriousness of this moment. And for us and it calls us to take very seriously the need to address both the intersection of space and race, which was kind of the basis of the first question that we're taking up here, but also the structures that reify the kind of anti-Black sentiments that we have been kind of talking about today.
Thank you all for those profound responses to that question. So part of what we're discussing and what we're showing in our conversation on today is that racial violence is kind of like water. It moves everywhere, right? It don't just like stop in the park or stop at the store, stop in your car. It goes everywhere you go. It just flows, right? Until something comes and staves it off. Racial violence then is also enacted through various institutions, and this sets it on a course for long-term effects. But racial violence doesn't end when you walk out that institution. It doesn't end when you leave that park. It doesn't end when you leave that store, but it is carried in the body. So because the effects are carried in the body, it means it also comes into the communities of the victims of racial violence and into the homes of those. So you got to carry it. So it's very embodied, right? And so then when we're dealing with globalized anti-Blackness, we're talking about racial violence that's seen, smelled, heard, all of it, right? With it. But at the same time, because it's carried and you're navigating through spaces, dealing with this racial violence, whether it's a sign that you see or something that's played on the TV or on the internet, right? Or something that is said with you, and you're carrying it through your body. It's this constant, nonstop, just being hit, and hit. And so it also then brings about trauma and this idea that Black folks and folks of color don't experience the trauma of daily violence, right? That comes, so the trauma of racial violence doesn't sit at the forefront of a lot of conversations about racism. So my question for our panelists is, why should we include serious conversations about racial trauma, and what can be achieved by us including racial trauma in our conversations about race in space, racism in space, and racial violence overall?
So I think, right, this is one of those ones where I will probably be looking at my actual writing because there are some points I really want to drive home. But right, like I think to echo your point, Dr. P, racial violence doesn't end when an incident ends, right? I think I hinted at it earlier, and many of us have talked about it. We relive those traumas every day, especially in this current reality where technology and the ability to record things becomes so easy. So, right, it lives in the body, in our memories, in our anticipations, in racialized trauma, in the most, racialized trauma is one of the more under-acknowledged things possible. And I am a person who considers myself a person of faith, right? And the beauty of faith is believing in the invisible, right? But when it comes to getting people to act towards justice, it is very, very difficult to get people to act towards something that they cannot see. And the issue with racialized trauma is that it is something that is so intimately held in the body and experienced in the mind and the heart that other people can't experience the severity of it. And each one of us, right, we all sit here and we present as African American, we live our lives day to day as African American, and our trauma from various incidences is different, right? How we internalize it, how we navigate it, how we make sense of it is different. And so because those experiences are not the same and they're not visible, it's very easy to overlook that. So for me, when we exclude racial trauma from our conversations, we implicitly ask people, particularly Black people, to perform resilience without rest, right? We ask them to do critique without care. We ask them, again, to be in survival without acknowledgement of including racial trauma's shifts, and it shifts the conversation from what happened to what lingers, right? So I think the beauty of bringing racial trauma into the conversation is that it allows us to have a conversation about what remains, right? A lot of the times we're only talking about what happened, and we do not spend enough time thinking about what remains. And I think that is the importance of bringing racial trauma into the conversation.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, and Dr. P, you mentioned it's stored in the body and the body keeps the score. And I think we should bring it up because it's real. We feel it, we see it. In the psychological literature, it's also called race-based traumatic stress. In addition to holding it in the body, it can show up similar to symptoms of PTSD, like hypervigilance, emotional numbness, disturbance in sleep, isolation and rage. And sometimes we pathologize those behaviors, and it's a response to a person's lived experience and their reality. And Dr. P, as you mentioned, it doesn't stop where we go. It didn't stop when you were on the metro in Denmark, you said, or when you're at the park or at the store, when your partner is walking in downtown Chicago. It isn't just one event. We have to talk about the cumulative impact of race-based stress and racial trauma. It can show up in everyday activities or microaggressions at the work and in various contexts. I think it's also important, and Dr. Butler, you hinted on this, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, I think we also need to talk about intergenerational resilience as well. So we all probably familiar with epigenetics and how trauma responses can be passed down, but so has intergenerational resilience. So Black people have been coping with racial trauma for centuries or even longer than that, and that has shown up as spirituality, Black joy. Some of these are buzzwords, but these are actually coping strategies. So spirituality, Black joy, creativity, cultural memory, radical hope, and resistance. So sometimes you may hear the question, why can't Black people get over it? We should also be asking, how do we treat a country after what it's done and what it continues to do to Black people's minds, bodies, and spirits?
Yeah, I would just add, the Denmark situation I think is important, and even something as simple as like driving while Black. I mean, is probably the most common example that that people experience. Or what is somebody going to think if I go into a tenure track faculty meeting at my institution and I wear my hair a certain way. I mean, these are things that might seem kind of superficial to people who have never experienced them, but there are considerations that we have to kind of think about on a regular basis. And I would suggest that sometimes I think it's difficult for people to kind of understand, race or issues of race and racism and the process of racialization as kind of this structurally embedded phenomenon. So it's hard to kind of understand that, but it's a lot easier, I think, and accessible to understand the racialized trauma that people kind of exhibit in their day-to-day lives. The other thing that I would say is, why racial trauma actually matters, in addition to kind of having the capacity to reshape the interactions that white people have with people of color. I think that's one thing to consider. I also think that it has implications for democratic institutions. And what I mean is that to the extent that we are able to fully recognize the ways in which institutions and structures induce this kind of racial trauma and acknowledge the existence of that, of the ways in which those institutions and structures induce racial trauma, I think it has the capacity to strengthen how people of color view these kinds of institutions within society in such a way that strengthens them, that gives us more confidence in something like law enforcement agencies. I mean, ICE is a really important case study that we are experiencing right now in how it is kind of inducing these kinds of racialized traumatic experiences on people of color in not just Minnesota, but in Chicago, and now in Columbus, Ohio, where I live. And so because of those kinds of experiences, it's decreasing the likelihood that we are going to believe in the efficacy of an agency like ICE. Or if we are involved with the criminal legal system and we are seeing these rampant racial disparities, it's going to decrease the likelihood that we believe in those kinds of institutions. But imagine a world where where the racialized trauma of people of color is actually acknowledged, and then remedies are created to kind of address that. It has the potential, I think, if we're talking about hope, to potentially reform those institutions and increase confidence in how people of color who have been wronged and traumatized by those systems engage with them.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson?
So all I can say is plus one. Plus one, plus one, plus one. But if I can make a small point, the experiences of trauma, Amber mentioned epigenetics. We now know from researchers of other stripes that in looking at the actual genetics of Jewish Americans who experienced the Holocaust, that the very structure of their genetic makeup is changed based upon that experience. That changed structure then gets carried forward across generations. We can apply the same knowledge and understanding to the experiences of African Americans. I had a great uncle who grew up in the South, just as I grew up in the South, and he once came over to our house as a child, and my brother had some friends over. They included some girls he went to school with who happened to be white. And I remember my uncle walked in the house, saw those young women, walked directly back to the kitchen and said to my mother, "You got to get them to leave. You don't know what they can say about those boys. They got to leave." Now, what that is the experience that he had over generations of what happens in interaction with white people, right? That for him proved to be harmful. And I too, even in the 80s, and I'm old. I'm getting more. I feel like the younger people that I work with in different spaces, I'm like, wow, I'm so much older than they are. How'd that happen? But anyway, growing up in the 80s in Kentucky, I literally saw the Klan dressed in all their full regalia, burning crosses. That's not that long ago. I don't want that experience to be transferred to another generation. So where does that lead us? I think that a lot of this failure to acknowledge the impact of trauma is based upon a politics of subtraction. If I acknowledge your experience, then I lose something from my experience. I think the lesson that can come from this is something about acknowledging not only that there is a politics of subtraction, but there's an additive culture that leads to greater sensitivity, greater understanding, greater reflexivity, and yes, potentially ways to address the impacts of the epigenetic component of trauma. One thing that I'll say, and I was trying to look for a quote, I wasn't speedy enough. I had the privilege of working as an evaluator for the last 2 or 3 years on a statewide initiative that Illinois is doing through their Department of Human Services. This particular initiative is a consequence of the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And to the state's credit, they recognize it as an inflection point. What can we do as a state to promote greater connections across all groups of Illinoisans? What can we do in this moment to better acknowledge racial histories and experiences? So what they came down on was a statewide initiative focused on racial healing. They have thus far given away over 3 or 4 years, close to $20 million to nonprofit organizations that are focused on developing and implementing programs focused on racial healing. This is happening across the state of Illinois from the southern tip to the northern tip. And as the evaluator for this project, I've had many opportunities to talk to people who attended these events, people who were facilitating these events, a variety of mixed methods in collecting the data. And the one thing that I always come down on are the stories that I hear of greater understanding. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase what I heard from one participant from last year's cycle. And this woman happened to be white, I think was in Quincy, Illinois. If you know anything about Illinois, it's further south and west, I think. Y'all can check me on the geography of Illinois. But it's a town that's 96% white, about 2% Black, and the rest is any other racial or ethnic group that might be living there in that space. And one of the things that she told me was, the more I know someone, the more I can see my own story in theirs. And I think when we talk about racial trauma, when we talk about racial violence, there's hope in that. Back to Professor Kaufman's earlier point, there's hope in that. How do we move again past that politics of subtraction to understanding that histories and experiences are additive, that when we address these things, we shore up the capacity to have everyone thrive?
Thank you all. So this is going to be our last question before we open it up for questions from the audience. So we'll make our responses pretty quickly. Now, currently, we are seeing the broadcasting of racial violence in real time. As an abundance of videos of Blacks and Black and brown folks being aggressively approached, treated, taken out of their homes, jobs, and personal properties. And knowing that the Supreme Court basically has given a go-ahead for racial profiling in immigration efforts, and it never stops there. But we want to talk about a little bit of hope. How do we temper down racial violence in the short and long term, given that the possibility if they continue, it won't be actualized? So I'm going to give you a scripture and then ask the question, because I always got to go to the word of God for you. Psalm 138 says, though I walk in the midst of trouble, thou wilt revive me. Thou shalt stretch forth thy hand against the wrath of mine enemies, and thy right hand shall save me. The Lord will perfect that which concerneth me. Thy mercy, O Lord, endureth forever. Forsake not the works of thine own hands. So as we consider the state that we're currently in, what are some of the avenues of peace, if any, that can be laid out even with these extreme obstacles and government-sponsored racial aggression and direct violence?
I can start. I think I'll build off of some of the points that Dr. Jackson mentioned. And I just want to talk about the importance of policy advocacy. We're talking about structures and how structures are leading to the harm, and policy advocacy and policy reform is a way to do that. So I think it's important to think about the legal framework, just as it was against the law for an enslaved person to so-called run away from their master to seek freedom. We're also seeing legal systems uphold state sanctioned and state-sponsored violence. We recently saw the Supreme Court's decision to allow racial profiling in immigration that is leading to all of the chaos that we're seeing across the country. And immigration enforcement is not an exception. So on the brighter side, and I think Dr. Jackson was referring to some of the great work in Illinois, around truth-telling, communities coming together, promoting racial healing. And we also saw that in the state of California. They've done a lot of great work on truth-telling, and with a lot more work to do. They started a reparations task force, Evanston, Illinois, the housing reparations. So we're seeing more efforts at the state and local level to stand up truth commissions. I think we're seeing a rolling back of that now, given some of the federal threat. So my hope in the future is that work could be built upon across the country. And I'm a sucker for acronyms and words. So thinking about building peace in the face of violence, I'll just use the word peace to kind of break that down and kind of weave into some of the points that I just mentioned. So P, like place-based healing. E, education and truth-telling, the importance of acknowledging the harm and naming a thing. A, the abolition of violent systems, safety, more community-based policing, more abolitionist-based frameworks when it comes to public safety. C, community restoration. So I think the panelists mentioned that some of the solutions already exist in communities from a policy perspective. How can we reallocate resources to what is working that are culturally relevant policies and practices that can be scaled throughout a state or nationally? And then E, my favorite, given my role in DC government, is equity in policy and practices. So how can we use existing tools and resources? We have the tools, we have equity tools where we ask direct questions to make sure that our policies, our practices, and our budgets aren't perpetuating harm, because we know that good intentions don't mean anything. Sometimes good intentions can cause more harm. So I just wanted to offer that framework.
If I may, I'll go next, only because I want to leave the last word to one of my esteemed panelists. I think that this is an important question, and I'm glad that we have a chance to consider it. I'm reading two books right now, just started reading one, but one is called Kings and Pawns. I don't know if you all have heard of this book yet, but it explores the lives of Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson, kind of from two different points of view of the African-American experience. With Paul Robeson kind of being vilified through the McCarthy era and post-McCarthy era, and Jackie Robinson taking alternate positions during that time. So anyway, but there's a second book that I've been trying to get through, and it's called Fragile Neighborhoods. It's by Seth Kaplan. And that book looks at local institutions and social ties to address challenges like crime, poverty, and alienation in American neighborhoods. He makes the argument in the book that zeroing in on local advocacy efforts, community-defined efforts, are the difference maker, and that we need to strive towards being more responsive, if you will, to that particular mechanism as a driver of social change. The thing that I will say about that most directly, because it impacts the work that I do in Chicago, I've worked with and still work with philanthropy quite frequently. And I've seen very large philanthropies in Chicago. One in particular has dedicated about $100 million towards change in Chicago's south and west sides. I've also seen another one more recently, a smaller philanthropy, dedicate about $3 to $5 million for that same purpose. So there's hope, because what we learn from those efforts, the way that philanthropy can operate, is that when they get findings, and most people are concerned about findings, they can use those to engage other civic partners, whether those be cities, whether that be state governments or other jurisdictions, into scaling up the things that work. So there's potential in that. However, I want to make a caution here, just as we wrap up, on that particular driver of philanthropy as one way of putting resources into communities. We're seeing now with the withdrawal of federal funds that private philanthropy is under attack for providing the kinds of resources that we've been talking about at the community level that are going to particularly provide support for Black and Brown people. I would say that there's a potential there for philanthropy to act something as a third rail, meaning that the withdrawal of federal funds puts the full reliance on philanthropy and other institutions that can't be sustained. So while we need to think about the potentials that come from initiatives that shore up the capacities of local communities to do the work that can make the kinds of changes that we've been talking about, just a cautionary note that we need to make sure that we have our traditional institutions in place that have for years in this imperfect union helped to stand up the things that we have seen that produce change.
I want to just kind of piggyback on what you just said regarding philanthropy. That's exactly what I was going to talk about, but I would just, as a word of caution, even as kind of philanthropy is kind of immune to kind of some of the isomorphic pressures of society that prompted to shift and change in these different directions. We have to be careful that philanthropy doesn't succumb to the nonprofit industrial complex, which endeavors to repress progressive social movement efforts aimed at achieving racial justice. And so I do think that philanthropy has the capacity because of the power dynamics that exist within this particular space, but also the immense kind of financial resources that are associated with private philanthropy. But their efforts are only going to be meaningful in the cause of what scholars have called racialized change work, only through the enlistment of the perspectives of those individuals with whom they are trying to use their resources to advocate on behalf.
I think just echoing what a lot of folks have said in this space, right? It's going to come down to community organizing, intentionality, and imagination, right? And I say imagination because we have to find ourselves in a position where we redream what is, right? And if you all will indulge me, right, I would just like to take a second, and if you would, just close your eyes for a second and think about the physical space, right? I want you to think about walking down the sidewalk towards the building. I want you to think about getting to the door of the building, coming into the hallway, the things that you see, the things that you smell, the things that you feel, right? And then I want you to imagine what it would feel like coming into these spaces if everything that I'm mentioning tells you you don't belong, right? And so for me, the answer or piece in this context is not forgetting the experience, but it is remembering what you feel when you enter into a space and you feel like everything in that space tells you you don't belong. And then we have to imagine a world where we can recreate spaces that create comfort and safety for everybody, right? We have historically constructed institutions and spaces for a select group of people. That is no longer sustainable. And as cynical as I am most days, I think, and again, you can open your eyes, I'm sorry about that part, but like as cynical as I am most days, right? Like I think the beauty of the chaos that exists in our world today is that people who historically have not had to confront the over-policing that's occurring right now. Because, right, like I look at ICE as the pinnacle of what policing has become in this country, right? For years, you had slave patrols, you had police systems that tortured, tormented, and physically accosted Black bodies. And what we're seeing now is that same kind of assault on a much larger scale for the first time in our history. So everybody feels it in a way that we have never been able to feel it as a collective before. And it is my hope that because we are all experiencing this shared trauma, that we can imagine a world that is different from the one that we live in, with new structures, new institutions, and a reformation, right? And I think when I was saying these kind of things, when I was in my program at Loyola, I was called crazy and cynical. But I think we're at a point where it becomes a really strong possibility if we can act collectively.
Okay. Thank you all. So now we want to open up the floor and online for questions that you may have. So while I'm waiting on either Jenna or Ari to bring the mic, I'm going to read one of the online questions. And this comes from one of our PhD students, Jemiah. She's like, as a Black graduate student from Chicago, who's currently living in DC during the military takeover, the point that Dr. Butler made about violence as ecology and space as pedagogy really stuck with me. If violence is ecological, so is policing. So what does space teach us about privacy, surveillance, and freedom today? Who wants to answer that question?
I was gonna say, like, this is where my personality has to come out, because the short and clear answer to that is it doesn't exist. Right. And I think that is what is most jarring to our country right now, is that people who historically have not had to understand that that hasn't existed for a certain group of people in this country's history, that it's now the reality of the large majority of the country. And that is what's terrifying.
Okay. Any questions here? You raise your hand and she'll bring the mic around if anyone has a question.
Hi, my name is Ali Sigevich, and I am actually one of Dr. P's first year students in her Introduction to Peace Studies class. And I appreciate all of you coming here and sharing your stories and sharing your experiences. In our Peace Studies class, we really have been talking about, is our culture becoming more violent, or do we have a violent culture? And my question is, can we undo the violence that has become embedded in our culture? And has our culture become more violent towards people of color? And how can we create peace through our interactions and dialogue?
I'll begin while they think on this. So thank you so much, Ali, for that question. Often we think something has increased when the only thing that really has increased is our awareness of it. The United States has been a nation that has promoted, sponsored, secured, funded violence in so many forms, from the first time an explorer came to the Antilles Islands, right? So the increase in violence is often perspective, right? And as panelists have pointed out, who is now enduring some of that violence, who may have not had to endure it before. And so I think that part of it is that our awareness towards the fact that state-sponsored violence has persisted across time and space in this nation is hard for some people, right? That the shock is, what do you mean this is not who we are? And some people be like, yeah, it is. You had the privilege of not having to consider that this is who the United States is. For all of its glory and all of its goodness, it has a foundation of violence, because racism itself is violent. Anything that harms the citizenry, right? That's what violence is. So I think in some aspects, it's not necessarily that violence has increased dramatically. A lot of it is our awareness of the violence of the state, but also violence of individuals as well. So, and technology has a lot to do with that, right? That the more we're able to communicate with each other, the more things we begin to learn about it. But also we're seeing an uptick in people responding to it in ways that they've never responded to the violence, being like, well, I don't like this. What do you mean this is who you are? I don't like it, so we're going to hit the streets, right? Where they may not have done that 40 years ago because it was just people of color talking, right? But then once you see it, just like, when people saw the dogs in the fire hoses during the civil rights thing, people have a different response to it. So, yeah, so that's part of an answer, not all the answer.
Thanks so much thanks so much for your question, and thanks for being here and engaging. And that's what you're supposed to be doing as a student at a place like this, I think. So it's good to see you here. I was listening to a sermon earlier while I was working out, and in response to kind of your question about can we undo the harm or the violence, and the minister quoted from, I think this is John, and I'm going to quote it in its entirety. We're at a Catholic institution. You know what I'm about to do. And it's in John 5 and 6. Are you there? That's what. And it reads, it says, when Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he said unto him, will thou be made whole? And the minister asked this question, like, does the United States want to be made whole? And I think that kind of goes back to what you were just asking. Can we undo the violence? And the question is, do we want to undo that violence? And we know in the biblical context, it's a rhetorical question. The man wanted to be made whole. But the question is more complicated for the United States of America. Do we want to be made whole on these issues? We can, but the question is, do you want to be? And then the preacher went on to say that it isn't just about, the capacity of Jesus being able to make people whole. It's about the personal responsibility to partner in those efforts to make people whole. I just said something you didn't get, but I'm gonna stop right there, though.
I appreciate the question and the conversation that you all are prompting. Because if we're gonna do it, I got to throw in 2 Corinthians, right? I will glory all the more in my infirmity, that the strength of the Lord might be made perfect in my weakness, right? And I think this also goes back to trying to tie these questions together and giving my more hopeful answer to the original to the first question as well, right? What do you do when everything that you understand about personal responsibility, spatial accountability, privacy, safety goes out of the window, right? And what do we do in this moment where I earlier was saying you don't have privacy, right? Like these things don't really exist for us anymore in this country. There is a profound beauty in letting go, right? I think when I say there's a profound beauty in letting go, it's understanding the beauty and the grace of weakness, right? And as we have lost these things that are fundamental to us, and I also got to say, when I was having this beautiful conversation with Dr. P earlier, and she was helping me to understand, right, like that when we find ourselves in a place that we are weak, we are vulnerable, we don't know which way to go, that is actually where hope lies, right? Because then we can look beyond ourselves to something bigger and greater than us, right? And for me, that is Christ. And to be able to say, I'm going to trust you because everything in the world demonstrates to me that the system and the space is broken. And that does not alleviate personal accountability because, right, like I've joked about this consistently, but I don't want to be found when it's my time not working. And so we have to do work to try to make changes, but you have to work from a position of surrender, right? And when we work from a position of surrender, what happens is those things that are beyond us, right? Like essentially, Dr. P, it's that part where you're saying being able to recognize the things that you don't want, right? In this moment, we as a country have a glaring opportunity to collectively see the way that bodies and people are being treated in the streets, right? And that broadcasting of that treatment allows us to all be able to say, what are the parts of our government and our, right, like police enforcement that don't make sense, right? That's not okay for us to do to anybody. And that's where we start, right? It's in this moment where everybody is feeling the tyrannical pressure of the police state that we can talk about what doesn't belong in our policing, right? Because it's built on a history of oppression and discrimination and really power and authority at its core. And so again, it's being able to be weak in a position of submission and letting God lead us into the work that we have to do, because it's about unification.
Anyone else? Okay. All right. Any more questions from? Yes.
That's okay. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience. My name is Luis. I'm a student of the first year of a Master in International Peace Studies. And my question is about best practices on reparation that you have seen at community level to heal and transcend racial violence. So I would like to understand a little bit more, what are those reparation practices that are taking place right now, or that have been taking place in the past?
Give a small response. However, this is not my area of expertise. But Evanston, Illinois is the first, I believe, city to pass local city ordinance that granted reparations to Evanstonians, whatever they're called, who have been there for more than one generation, access to housing and home ownership, and some other kind of what should be regarded as human rights, social safety nets that are naturally occurring in our society, and they're not. However, Evanston has tried to make inroads toward that. So I think that there are other efforts going on, while not reparations specifically. We're not going to get the 40 acres and a mule that African Americans were promised, but we might get baby bonds. There's a lot of talk about how baby bonds can be used to support children who are born with fewer resources, so that they might be able to offset what they don't have in their families with these bonds that mature over time, where they might then, once they become 18 or 21, whatever a state might designate, they could then draw upon those funds to buy a house, to go to school, to start a business. And so those are things, avenues that we can look at. And there's one other thing that I want to just say in response to the moment that we're in. And this is not directly related to your question. However, I do think that it's a tangential kind of consideration that we might kind of bookmark for this conversation. We have seen in the last 2.5 weeks, 2 American citizens die as a result of terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. Those 2 people who died in the streets of Minnesota happen to be white United States citizens. And so their deaths are regretful and tragic, and they should never have happened. Those 2 people should still be here with us today. However, there's a role that they were playing that's so critically important to keeping alive conversations about reparations and justice. And that role is a role of being an ally, a role of being an advocate, a role of being an allyship with people who you see yourself in, or people who you recognize particular experiences that are unjust. And so as we start to think about reparations, let's not only think about what that looks like exacted in policy, but what it looks like to actually move it forward. And I think allyship is part of that process.
And I'll just be really quick. I agree with everything that Dr. Jackson said. So I would look at Evanston. I would look at the state of California and DC. We have a draft bill that establishes a reparations task force. I think something to look out for that wouldn't be best practices is around how whatever is determined by community, how it's funded. So we don't want to see regressive structures, say, sales tax as a way to fund it. In theory, that may sound good, but think about who's bearing the burden of sales tax, and having that being, taken away from their income. So truth-telling, acknowledgement at the city or jurisdiction level, conversations to promote a better understanding of the historical racial trauma. And then also when it comes to standing up these commissions and task forces, being very thoughtful about who is on the commission, obviously, hopefully folks with lived experience of racism and structural racism, paying attention of who is being listened to, and then also letting community drive what reparations look like. So it could look like baby bonds. It could look like an Illinois housing reparations. It could look like direct cash assistance that's unrestricted. So I think when we talk about policy advocacy, really making sure, which is the definition of racial equity that we talk about in our work, making sure that we're incorporating the lived experiences of those who have been most harmed by systems into government decision-making as one of the best practices.
All right. Do you all want to make any final comments before we wrap this up? Anything that yeah. Me, I don't have anything final to say other than, again, a great thanks to the Kroc Institute and for all those who helped to put this together. I want to thank Ari over there on the side. Thank you so much. To Kate, our communications person who's here in the front, and Jenna's up there somewhere in the tower. Everything's going online, and we want to, continue to think. Someone did ask questions about, do we know of examples of visual and spatial justice and peace work? And I wanted to remind people that, and to ask yourself the question, why do we always have such a hard time doing justice but have no problem not doing justice, to be unjust? Like, why does it seem to be such a complicated thing? And the Word of God is constantly reminding us about mercy, truth, and justice, right? For those who are believers, or in most religions have that as well. But in our own part of the world, there's always something we can do. And one is to do no harm, to do our best to not add to a different, on a day-to-day basis, to see people as humans, to see people's humanities. Well, you're not going to know everybody's story that you run into, but if we see people, because to make people invisible is violence itself. And to not reproduce violence, like be a good citizen and do well. And those are the types of things that can counteract so much of the violence that takes place. Just to put peace into the spaces that you enter, whether it's a store, a train, a bus, a car, but to carry peace in your body, but also to share that peace as you move into the area. And the Word of God even tells us that we are supposed to be the light of the world, a city that sitteth on a hill that cannot be hidden. And so I just want to encourage you with that. And again, thank you for coming out in the weather. For those who are online, thank you for being with us as well. And to our esteemed panelists, please just give them a hand for traveling across the U.S. to be here with us today and taking the time to share their expertise and knowledge. And thank you all again. And that's it, people. I mean, do you need a benediction?